Good evening and welcome to those of you who are joining us. I'm glad to see the participant list is growing by the second. We are just going to give people a couple of minutes to join and then we will get officially started. So welcome everyone. Good evening. I'm Joel Berkowitz, Director of the Sam and Helen Stahl Center for Jewish Studies and Professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Welcome to a conversation between my UWM colleague, Rachel Ida Buff, and Francisco Goldman, whose most recent novel, Monkey Boy, was recently named a finalist for the 2022 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, one more honor for a book that had already been highly praised and feted. Before I turn the floor over to our speakers, a few words of introduction and thanks. The Stahl Center supports UWM's Jewish Studies program and organizes public events like this one on a wide variety of subjects in our field. For more information about Jewish Studies at UWM, please go to our website, and if you don't follow us already on social media, you can find us on Facebook and Twitter under the handle @UWMJewish. Tonight's event continues an ongoing series called The Colors of Jewishness that we launched in 2016 as a vehicle for exploring the Jewish experience as the global, multi-ethnic, multiracial phenomenon it is. Past presenters include culinary historian Michael Twitty, painter Siona Benjamin, Ladino singer-composer Sarah Aroesti, Yiddish singer-composer Anthony Russell, and filmmaker Lacey Schwartz. We are thrilled to add Francisco Goldman to that distinguished list. We bring you this event in partnership with our friends at Boswell Book Company. Special thanks to Daniel Golden and his wonderful staff for once again partnering with us to bring great Jewish authors to our audiences. Huge thanks as well to Deb Seeger at Grove Press, without whom this event would not have been possible. We thank our other co-sponsors, UWM's Department of English and Creative Writing and Cultures and Communities programs. I'm grateful to Rachel Baum, Deputy Director of the Stahl Center, for helping figure out countless details related to the event. And finally, many thanks to our generous sponsors, Bader Philanthropies and the Ettinger Family Foundation, for underwriting the cost of this event and others in the series. Now, a few words about tonight's speakers. An immigration historian, Rachel Ida Buff teaches history and comparative ethnic studies at UWM, where she is also a founding member and past president of the campus chapter of the American Association of University Professionals, which fights to keep public education democratic. She is author most recently of Against the Deportation Terror, Organizing for Immigrant Rights in the 20th Century, and A is for Asylum Seeker, Words for People on the Move, A de Asilo, Palabras para Personas en Movimiento, an abecedary of terms for people on the move. Currently, she is working on a novel, Holy Toledo, an immigrant justice-themed feminist reverse marriage plot, and a collection of essays, Thinking Like a Caravan, Resilience and Survival in the 21st Century and Beyond, which takes the aspirations of asylum seekers as models for contemporary political formations. She is a member of Milwaukee Jewish Voice for Peace and Never Again, Wisconsin. Francisco Goldman has published 5 novels and 2 books of nonfiction. The Long Night of White Chickens was awarded the American Academy's Sue Kaufman Prize for First Fiction. His novels have been finalists for several prizes, including twice the PEN/Faulkner Prize. The Ordinary Seaman was a finalist for the International IMPAC Dublin Literary Award. The Divine Husband was a finalist for the Believer Book Award. The Art of Political Murder won the Index on Censorship TR Fievel Book Award and the WOLA Duke Human Rights Book Award. The Interior Circuit, a Mexico City Chronicle, was named by the LA Times one of the 10 best books of 2013 and received the Blue Metropolis Premio Azul 2017. His novel Say Her Name won the 2011 Prix Féminin Étranger. His books have been published in 16 languages. Francisco Goldman has been a Guggenheim Fellow, a Cullman Center Fellow at the New York Public Library, and a Berlin Fellow at the American Academy. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He received a 2017 Barnes & Noble Writers Prize, was named a recipient of PEN Mexico's 2017 Award for Journalistic and Literary Excellence, and was a 2018 and 19 Fellow at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute. He has written for The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, Harper's, The Believer, and many other publications. He directs the Ora Estrada Prize. Every year he teaches one semester at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, and then hightails it back to Mexico City. And those are his words, not mine. Just one note about how we're going to proceed. Rachel and Francisco will be in conversation, and we are going to open up the Q&A, so feel free to drop questions there at any time, and we will leave some time for them to get to at least some of those questions. And now it's with great pleasure that I bring you Rachel Ida Buff and Francisco Goldman as I hightail it into the background.
Hey, Francisco.
Hey, Rachel.
So congratulations on camera for the honor of being a Pulitzer finalist. You were telling us about how exciting that was. Do you want to maybe recap that a little for our audience?
It was just so completely unexpected, right? It was really a nice surprise. It'd been a great week already, because why were these things happening a year later? A year after my hardcover came out, we suddenly got this really beautiful long review in the New York Review of Books. That sort of made my year in some way. I was happy with that. That was an incredible surprise. And then, one morning my editor phoned, and she was really sweet, and she really wanted this book to do well, and she was crying and told me that we were one of the 2 finalists for the Pulitzer Prize. And it was a really sweet surprise, I have to say.
So lovely and deserved. So let's talk about Monkey Boy.
We celebrated by now that we have 2 small children. Our way of celebrating was to stay up an hour later and watch 2 episodes of Atlanta before going to bed.
And by an hour later, you mean 9 p.m.
Yeah.
So let's talk about Monkey Boy, which I'm a huge fan of yours. So when I read it, I was thinking about your first novel, which is also kind of a coming of age novel, The Long Night of the White Chickens. But it's different to write a coming of age novel later in life than earlier in life. So what was it like to write this very autobiographical novel about, some significant injuries that happened to you early in your life? What was it? It's an incredibly deep dive into your and many other pasts.
Well, Long Night of White Chickens was, unlike some of the other books that I began with a pretty clear idea of what I wanted to do, like An Ordinary Seaman and Divine Husband. What one thing Long Night of White Chickens and Monkey Boy have in common is when I started those books, I had no idea where I was going. Right? I knew I was sort of writing out of, my own life, which promises a much more labyrinthine and difficult roads ahead. Than knowing what your territory is and having some kind of real fixed idea what you want the novel to do. So both of these were novels where I was just lost in for years, trying to figure out why, what is it I was looking for in these novels. And Long Night, because I was much younger, of course, I was dealing with, one of the great shocks of my life, which was living so close to the extraordinary violence and horror of the Guatemalan Civil War, dirty war, repressive military dictatorship, everything else of the 1980s. A lot of that book was written while I was living those things, right? And so you feel those things coming right into the book. And he's also, it was my way returning to going to live in Guatemala all those years, was really my way of, as a very young man, of marking out my own fictional territory. Which is the thing, I haven't grown up in the Massachusetts suburbs, but obviously knowing I was not destined to be either a John Updike or a John Cheever or Philip Roth as Newark, I knew that I came from a very different kind of background. And when the wars of the late 70s and 80s got underway, which brought my two worlds together in a terrible collision, Massachusetts and Guatemala, Central America, I knew I had to be there. I knew that whatever kind of writer I was going to be was going to have to start there. And that I was going to have to find, and I very much, that's really why I first went down in 1979. And so Long Night of White Chickens was sort of a way of, finding out who I was as a young person. And it wasn't so much about dealing with the difficult family that matters. In fact, it's fiction, so you don't say lie, but those parents, were, as I even say in the book, it's a joke. I did not want to be accused. I did not want my mother to say, "You wrote about me," right? So I made the mother in Long Night of White Chickens exactly the opposite of my mother, in many ways.
She said that anyway. You say in Monkey Boy, she was complaining that you wrote about everything.
I wrote about everything, but her funny line too is like, she goes, "But now everybody thinks that's what I'm like." The first one. And yeah, then she said, but a lot of family stories got it there, right? She had this very, it's very typically Guatemala, and even to a certain degree Latin American, to want to keep all family secrets, all our skeletons stay in our closets. And so yeah, she would get very embarrassed whenever I told a family story in print, and even if it was a benign story, or a funny story.
So if the Long Night of the White Chickens was about marking territory as a young man and the painful historical collision you describe, all of that is in Monkey Boy, but it's layered in a really different way. How are they different for you? How is writing Monkey Boy different?
Monkey Boy is different because obviously it's a looking back, and because it took such a long time to write, and because it was written during a period of so much upheaval in my life, it kept changing, right? Its goal kept changing. It took me a long time literally to find that book. And in a way, I think of it as the third book, in a period that was triggered by the death, the sudden, incredibly tragic, horrible death of my wife, Aura Estrada, in 2007, when she broke her neck in a body surfing accident in Oaxaca. And I was about to start then. I had just finished Artificial Murder. A few years before that, I'd published Divine Husband, the Jose Martin novel. And I was about to start this novel set in New Bedford among the Guatemalan immigrants, very much your kind of theme, Rachel, the Guatemalan immigrants in New Bedford. And this happened, and it sent me into a long, 15 years of more introspective writing. Say Her Name, which is about obviously about Auda and grief, and the raw grief. And Interior Circuit is in some ways, Interior Circuit is about coming out of grief, and the role Mexico City, my life in Mexico City, played in that, and also the circumstance of confronting that Mexico itself as a country full of people going through the kind of traumatic loss I'd gone through in a different way, suddenly losing my wife, and I was trying to find out if that in any way allowed me, having experienced that kind of loss, helped me understand what other people were going through better, right? That's really the theme of Interior Circuit. And then Monkey Boy began, again in that, although it's a fiction, there's a lot that's fictional in Monkey Boy, as real as its as its circumstances are. And that was began in the spirit of like a real self-examination. No, it begins with a kind of brutal idea where, again, the book overcomes this idea, I have to say, right? But the germ of it was kind of really brutal and punishing on myself, where I was saying, I obviously found love late in life, right? This is like really survivor's guilt taken to the max. I found love late in life. Why did it take me so long? And if it hadn't taken me so long, if it hadn't taken me so long, then I probably, I would have gotten married in my 30s and lived that kind of life. I never would have met Aura. So she'd still be alive. So, who was responsible for that? Right? Was it upbringing? Was it me? Was it, those sorts of questions? And those are the questions that triggered that search. Now, in the midst of writing this book, my life changed so many times. I fell in love again, right? I became a father. All these beautiful things kept happening. So this book that began in this very dark mood, right? Its origin ended up like something that, like a stream that sort of flows out of a dark place. It suddenly began to be fed by all these sort of joyous tributaries, right? And that makes those tensions really become what the book is, this examination of the past that in a strange way, as you say, it confronts hard things, but it becomes kind of like a hopeful search too, right? And a comic one in some ways, laughing at yourself is always the key. If you can't laugh about, no matter how painful the subject is, if you can't find a way to laugh at yourself and circumstances, your own circumstances and those you share with others, you're not going to write a book that, really worth sharing with people, right? So
it's remarkable because it is humorous. You and I were just talking about the bicentennial part and you wearing that costume on that boat, and the bicentennial was itself kind of just ridiculous, right?
yeah,
And funny. It has a lot of lightness, a lot of irony, but it's really a book that's profoundly about violence, about the violence of your home, about the casual ongoing violence of racism, about the Guatemalan Civil War. Even like we were talking this a little before too, like you keep meditating on King Philip's War and this like terrible past, that we were talking a little bit Melville as well, and that, the American Renaissance is haunted by that blood-soaked outcome of the Pequot and King Philip's Wars. So it's a really interesting combination, and there's so much suffering and violence in Monkey Boy, and it still is funny, which is remarkable. But it's really interesting to me how you keep those different incredibly painful layers going.
Because partly because the book is about this narrator who is reflecting on these things rather than living them in the moment. He may have lived them in the past, as in the Central American War, right? So it's a person who has a complex personality, part of it humorous, part of it with a tendency to laugh at things, others to explore things in idiosyncratic and eccentric ways, to take things that aren't his and make them his, and everything else, right? And so it's a voice that's telling you this story, right? It's a voice that moves in time. And sometimes that voice is connected to the present, and other times it's traveling into the past, but always filtered through this voice. And and just what's there? Well, I grew up in New England. I've always had this I have that, native son's love of that earth where he mostly grew up. I've always had it. Now, obviously, something in me, I can't really put my finger on it, finds a correspondence between that dark revolutionary history of Guatemala, right, and the wars in Central America, right? And as a young, I can tell you, more frivolous things, like as a young guy, as a young boy, I was just so in love with the heroic history of Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys. And I just was, the way other kids were out like fantasizing about superheroes, right? I was constantly fantasizing about Ethan Allen, the French and Indian War, the Sons of Liberty, Johnny Tremaine. That's the stuff that filled my head like crazy, right? And then as I become, and some of that was like, I'm sure a lot of that had a lot to do with my young man's, I'm talking about like being 21, 22, hunger to go to the war in Central America and be there, right? That I didn't go out of political conscience necessarily. I also went as a young man who all his life had hungered for these kinds of adventures, right? The classic old Hemingwayan thing, no? And that's part of it, right? As well as like a search for your own roots and all that kind of thing. And my love for Latin American literature. I mean, as a very young man, I said, I'm American, I'm from New England, but I'm also from Guatemala. And I want to be a Latin American novelist who writes in English, essentially, and I want to do what my heroes did, and I want to be down there and be around those wars and be around those revolutions. And so obviously, the echoes of the American Revolution and the early migrant culture, as you say, of the whaling ships and the colonial Boston, obviously had like profound echoes and all sorts of correspondences with coming from Guatemala, which is a mainly Native American country. I have a ton of Mayan blood in me, and also African blood, as well as Russian, Ukrainian, Jewish blood, right? Some Spanish blood. It's and those things, you feel the pull of those things, and then the correspondences between Mayan indigenous brutally colonized Guatemala, and that past of King Philip's War, and and what happened in the colonies, and particularly like a character, I mean, like Witamu, right? The Indian, she was like a female chief, basically, right? She was related to King Philip, and who led, in the same way, all those centuries later, Mayans had to flee into the forests, into the so-called comunidades, the CPRs, right? The communities of population resistance, who went off and lived for years in the forest to evade the army. She led her tribes, or her people, who were about to be enslaved by the British and the Puritan colonists, into a long exodus into the forests, right? There's still people living around the south coast of Massachusetts who, owe their lives, their very existence on this earth, because Witamu led them into the forests, like a female First Nation, Moses, right? So those correspondences, I just loved. In her tragic end, to find out that, finally the Puritans caught her and decapitated her and put her head on a stake in Taunton, Massachusetts. And just the word Taunton, like I grew up, those words, the names of those towns, that's my boyhood, right? And so all those, and nobody ever talks about Witamu, right? This martyred heroine, no one talks about her, right? And so there's no high school name for her. There's a Prince Philip High School, but there's no Witamu High School, right? So that kind of history has always sort of lived inside me, does it, and I keep chasing it, right? I keep chasing those phantoms across borders, really, right?
I love the correspondence you're drawing, and it comes across in the book in a very not linear way. The correspondence you're drawing between the atrocities of the Guatemalan Civil War and those of the early Indian Wars in New England. It comes across so clearly without the exposition, which you wonderfully just rendered. And it made me, something else that you talk about in the book, you talk about when you were researching Jose Marti for your book on him. And it really struck me as a working historian. You talked about, I love this, you talked about being in the archives and looking for the places where the trail got cold, because that's where you'd write the fiction.
Right.
And that's a very, so novelists, as somebody who writes history and also novels, but history, we're always like kind of jumping from rock to rock, and like trying to make a story. And you're really diving into the holes between the rocks where the story really lives. So
Yeah.
I wonder if you could talk a little more in that way about process, because I think you do lay out this kind of gorgeous, violent history of New England in Monkey Boy and put yourself in it.
Yeah,
And
I mean, I used to say I already discussed one of the sources, a more recent source, of my writing, which was like that loss in 207 and the pain of that and whichever. But before that, I would have said like the really thing that my real muse in a sense was a sense of place,
Mhm.
right? This always looking for these correspondences between my places. And I found that especially in Jose Marti, right? Who I live in Mexico City, and Jose Marti, after he fled, when he's exiled from Cuba as a very young man, lived in Mexico City, had an incredibly important bit more of a year of his life spent in Guatemala, and then goes and spends 16 years in New York City, right? Living, a life as a freelance writer at first, right? A freelance journalist. I was living as a freelance journalist. And so my way into Marti, who was through those places, right? Saying, well, those are my places and they were his places. So I have, my Marti is sitting right there for the taking through those places. And the way that happened, though, the way that book came about, I'll never forget it. I just had spent, it was like a moment where I was like approaching burnout on the violence of the Central American Wars. It had been too long, too much. And I was standing, on a street corner in Guatemala City one day. It's just so sick of everything, right? Just so sick of death, corruption, political cynicism, lies, politics, political hypocrisy, everything. I just had it. And I just was sitting there spacing out in the street corner. I remember. And so I said, so I wonder what the truth is about that famous poem, La Niña de Guatemala, this love poem Marti wrote about a love affair he consummated or unconsummated, nobody knew, with a teenage girl, and he wasn't much older, he was 26, in Guatemala City. I said, so what's the story behind that poem? And I literally went almost right across the street into the hemeroteca, the archive of all the old newspapers. It was just so fantastic, I mean, talk about that, so poor. It was so, there was not even any electric lighting. You had to get a desk by the window so you could read what they brought you. And this man would bring me out these 19th century newspapers, and I'll never forget the day, these 19th century newspapers that had not been opened since the 19th century. No one had looked in them. And I'll never forget the day I opened up and I found a little announcement. The young maestro Jose Marti, right, offering a writing class for young women. That art which so elevates a woman's something or other, dignity or something, right? And that's the very class where he met her. And there it was in a newspaper, and that just set me down that hole for years. But
I know our audience probably wants to talk mostly about Monkey Boy. So, but I did have a question about that. One of the painful experiences you recount in there repeatedly is, and I think this is very common for Jews of color in this country, is constantly being misidentified. Like, you're not Guatemalan enough because your last name is Goldman, or you're not Jewish enough because you're Guatemalan. There's this constant sense that you're never the right person. You're never who you're supposed to be projected by your audience. And that's a story that I've heard by attending this series, The Color of Jewishness, repeatedly from different folks. Can you talk a little more about that sort of and the theme of the book, I think, is people are constantly being misidentified. There's that witness towards the end that you think is in the restaurant, and then it's somebody else. There's this constant misidentification. I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, that's a frustrating and painful fact of life in a country like the United States, especially, that's so obsessed with categorizing people, right? And categorizes people usually by their most obvious trait and only that trait. So that might be black skin for someone else. That might be a Jewish surname for somebody else, right? And that those categorizations leave out, really essentially, disfigure you and leave out who you are. And I think this is and I think Monkey Boy is kind of hopefully a bit of a breakthrough book in the sense that, there are millions and millions of us in the United States. There's so much intermarriage, though. And the book, Monkey Boy, makes fun of a bit of the way, like, in a way, the publishing business doesn't want to know about us because it doesn't know how to shelve us, right? Where do you put them on the bookshelves, right? It's like we sell, the obvious categories, right? Black, Latino, Latinx, Asian, and so forth. But what do we do with all these mixed people, right? Well, we don't have to categorize us, right? We have our lives to tell, but we shouldn't be pushed aside. And there's millions of people like us. I hope this story, is one of the first novels, I think, that really speaks to this, right? And in the book, I talk about trying to find other writers who had lived this, knew about it, right? And the only two fiction writers I could find, I'm sure there's Marcel Proust, right? But the only other two writers I could find that were more recent were Muriel Spark, who was a wonderful writer, but had a very, I think it's not exaggerated to say she was a kind of a self-hating Jew, right? And then my heroine, Natalia Ginsburg, right, who really showed me a path, her book. I think if there's a book that, even though I read it after I'd begun, and there was a book that sort of was my spirit sibling, it's her novel, Family Lexicon, right? Which is her, and she came from a mixed family in Turin with a Jewish father and a Catholic mother, like myself. She was Italian, though. She didn't come from, Libya or something, but still, right? She had that experience growing up of being an outsider and not quite fitting in. And yet her family is glorious. She tells this story, and the story is so free of any kind of, self-pity in that way, or free of just exertions of forcing herself to identify with this or that. She just lives, through this incredibly dramatic historical time, of course, right? The fascist Italy, and her lover, her husband, father of her children, was a leader of the resistance. He was Jewish. He died and tortured to death by the SS in Rome, right? And the delicacy, it's her terseness in talking about this, right? It so moved me because it was so, by not wallowing in it, she makes it so much more expressive, right? And she finally came to the conclusion, which, I mean, it's there in her writing, and it's also what I extrapolated was this we to make ourselves ridiculous talking about identity in the way the culture wants us to talk about identity, right? So I grew up as a child always saying this incredibly clownish thing, because that's what I was supposed to say. I'm half Jewish and half Catholic. Half, Russian immigrant family, half Guatemala. And of course, this is ridiculous. Nobody's half and half anything. This is a stupid way to talk about being a human being, right? We don't live that way. We don't sit there thinking, oh, here's my Catholic self, here's my Jewish self, right? As Natalia Ginsburg in certain words at one point said, I am fully Jewish and I'm fully Catholic, right? I am fully Italian. I'm fully who I am. And all these things are a part of me. And I'm 100% all of these things. And I don't need to obsess on it. I am who I am, and take it or leave it. And this was just so liberating to me to finally understand that was the right way to think and talk about this.
I love that corner of the novel where you're finding Sparks and Ginsburg. It's not unlike the way you're thinking about King Philip's War in Guatemala, like the way that you create these correspondences and find solace and try and explain things, which leads me to kind of a question I'm not sure how to ask, which is that your writing is so Baroque. There's so much going on. There's so many whirlwinds and worlds in every page, yet you still tell stories. So I'm just wondering about your experience of temporality with this book, because it is in one way a coming of age story about a painful upbringing being called Monkey Boy, getting to leave that place and move on with your life. But there's a million other stories impacted into it, including a contemporary love story in Brooklyn and the story of you in Guatemala and the story of your mother and your family. Like, it's really Baroque. It's really curly, not straight, but you're telling narratives. I don't know if I'm making any sense, but what does your mind look like? You know, how do you say,
Yeah.
feel like, is it
I was,
one
you know,
story and then you're weaving it with others, or do you,
I'll tell you, it took me forever to write that book. At one point, there was an 800-page draft. There was an 800-page draft. And then the book came together in the last year. I wrote the whole book in the last year. And when I gave that to my agent, almost none of those prior 800 pages were there. She said, "Oh my God, what did you do? You wrote a whole other book." You know, and it was a search, right? It was a search for a way to describe the self in time, right? It's this, you know, the frame of the book. It's a 5-day trip home. That's all it is. The novel is a 5-day trip home.
It's deceptively simple.
And those 5 days home contain a whole life,
Yeah.
right? And always the key for me to this book was to make it look simple, to make it easy to follow. It was incredibly complicated underneath to find that structure, to find that order of stories, but it had to look, that's where the art, the discipline, the artistry, whatever you want to call it, intuition of what comes next, the intuition of the shape of a narrative, that's where the hard work came in.
Does it come to you in shapes? Like, do you have a picture, or do you have notes? Is it like A Beautiful Mind and you're writing?
Yeah, eventually it's really like that.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You look for structure, and the structure is the meaning of the book. Because if I could sit there and tell you what the book was about, there would be no reason to write it, right? What the book is about, the meaning of the book, is the book itself. And that is, and what the book wants to say is right there from page 1 to page 230. And that's the way it moves. That's the structure of the book that gives it its meaning, right? How these stories flow into these stories, and I knew, and that was really, where all the effort went. I wanted it to be fun to read, and easy, and pretty easy to follow. And and as I say, the book became I think that's why that last year took off so well. I probably finally understood that though the book had begun in a very dark place, it wasn't about that darkness, and it wasn't going to be dragged down with that darkness. It was in fact a book that moves toward self-acceptance and celebration and understanding and forgiveness and all those, I think of the story. If you look at the story, also, it was a book very much what I was wanted to write. And why shouldn't I? This thing that people say, you can't write this, you can't write that. Well, of course, why I wanted to write about women in my life. My whole life. Right now, I live in a house, with a wife and 2 little girls. Right? My upbringing, I lived in a house with my mother, my sister, the woman from Guatemala. There's always a young woman from Guatemala living with us, and my dad. I mean, my whole, so many of my whole life has been surrounded by women, right? And I've worked with colleagues, lovers, difficult love, everything. And I wanted to also tell that story, right? And I think if you look closely, as you read the book, you see that everyone in the novel is trying to overcome something, right? It really is a book about people too overcoming things. They have whatever their particular thing they need to overcome is. It gets, sometimes glancingly dramatized in the book. So, that became, because that's the way you also create meaning in a book, right? Is through patterns. You keep hitting certain things that correspond with each other. And so that was certainly a big part of the texture of the book. People, all these different women characters who have this problem they have to get over, right? So
there's like a text comes into chapter 20, like boom, and there she is again. It's lovely. I just want to ask you one more question, and then I think Joel's going to want to open it up for Q&A. I was listening to the Ukrainian writer, Andrei Kurkov, talking about language And, I was thinking about, he was talking about being a Ukrainian writer who's ethnically Russian and has always written in Russian, and how he and a lot of other people are really rethinking that right now. And it resonated when you were saying, I want to be a Latin American novelist writing in English, because your prose is always so richly multivocal. Like, there's Spanish, there's Spanish, there's English, there's lots of different different argots in it. Do you at all rethink the decision to write in English, or what are those language politics for you like right now?
Yeah, no, I'm very much an English language writer from an immigrant background, double immigrant background. And writing as an American is the right way for me to write. As much as I'm engaged with a space that includes other countries, right? I was really interested in when I went to the Whitney Biennial this year. The Whitney Biennial every 2 years celebrates contemporary American art, which has always been defined as art that takes place in the United States. And it was really interesting to see how that is now expanding, right? So for the first time in this Whitney Biennial, they included Mexican artists from the border areas and Canadian, Native American artists from the areas like just north of the United States. So even there, the idea was saying, well, when we talk about North American art, being a North American artist, that doesn't, those boundaries can expand, right? And I really think of my place, as this place that extends from Central America to New England, and it's one place to me. And the language in which I always, there's a bilingual aspect that I'm always hearing things in Spanish. And I so wish I spoke Quiche, which is the first language of most of the immigrants in New Bedford. I'm going to have to find a way to maneuver that. But English is, it's the most right language for me to work in.
I just want to remind folks that if you have a question for Francisco, you can write it in the chat or write in the Q&A, I'm sorry, and we will be happy to ask it for you. So please feel free to write those. Otherwise, I think we're just going to keep on talking. We were talking before a little bit, and you've mentioned New Bedford a number of times about the new novel. Do you feel, are you ready? I have a friend who's a novelist who never talks about what she's working on. It's like she's in the audience tonight. So shout out to that friend. So if you just want to tell me to shut up, my friend would be completely appreciative of that. But you were talking about New Bedford. In fact,
well, it's I don't mind saying a bit about it because the book Monkey Boy ends in New Bedford partly. Right, it's you see where it's headed there in some ways, and that his sister has bought a house there, and it's there's some mystery of why is her house full of Guatemalans? Right?
I have this really utopian, like she's living in this utopian commune kind of sense, but it's very short, that section.
Yeah,
I wanted more, so I'm glad you're doing more.
It's a bit of a coming attraction. It's right. It's also there's his distance from his sister. He really has no idea what his sister's doing and how she lives, right? It's something that he realizes that's a failing of his own, right? It's look, I first got interested in New Bedford years ago. It must have been around 2003 or something, when I read in the Boston Globe, maybe, that Rigoberta Menchú had come to New Bedford because there was a community of like 5,000 Mayans there. And I said, Rigoberta Menchú in New Bedford? What? And that began my obsession with that town. And the first time I went to New Bedford, I looked up a woman, incredible, extraordinary woman named Corinne Williams, who is a community activist who has done so much for, in providing guidance and creating community spaces for that Mayan community, Guatemalan community, or the whole Central American community, actually. And I remember that day I walked into her office. She had read Long Night White Chickens. She had no, and I had no idea she had any idea who I was. I walked in, told her who I was, and she said, "I had a feeling you were going to show up here someday." And she's read my, and that community in New Bedford is now something like 20,000 Guatemalan Mayans, maybe more. And it's, as we were talking about before it started, this is like the way Herman Melville, of course, Moby Dick begins in New Bedford, right? And to Melville, the makeup, the crews of the whaling ships to Melville, right, represented truly a progressive, almost utopian vision of what American democracy could be. Right, those were the people from all over the world were crewing those ships. People, who marginal cast-off people who, had a chance to find a place in life on the whaling ships, and eventually even in New Bedford and Fairhaven and the towns around there. That vision of what the United States can be is still very present, right? It's more present than ever in some ways. New Bedford is like a border town.
Yeah.
Right. It's like a border town, and in good ways and bad ways. There's a lot of contraband, smuggling, crime, right? It's but it has that fervent, that incredible mixture of peoples, and there on the Atlantic Ocean in the Northeast, that I'm just so fascinated by it. And New Bedford is still the #1 fishing fleet in the country.
And an old place, getting back to what we were talking about a little bit before, I have a friend who's a historian and has done a lot of digging into New Bedford. I'll hook you up, don't worry. But
Yeah.
a lot of mixed race marriages and couplings going back to the 17th century. So in terms of like what American is and who we are identified, like my friend has been tracing that, particularly with Indigenous folks in the area, and just found like huge communities of mixed race people living there from really early on, even though that gets completely occluded in the record, like no one knows about that.
And it was also a very important Underground Railroad town. Well, Frederick Douglass lived there, right? Frederick Douglass began autobiography of a slave while living there. Right. I also heard a fascinating story. I'm not sure this works into my novel, but because the whale ship captains were Quakers, they were abolitionists. And the Underground Railroad didn't just run to the north. Often, right, they would pick up escaped slaves in the ports of Charleston and so forth, the whaling ship captains, and they would let them off in places like Mexico. And so there's a whole community of Mexican slave, freed, escaped, now free, freed Africans from the South that New Bedford and Nantucket whale ship captains delivered to Mexico and other islands in the Caribbean, and let them off there. And they married and created, and created these sort of mixed race small communities. There's a professor at the University of Texas who's been doing research on that a historian in New Bedford put me in touch with. So it's just an incredible community. It's history and the way it lives now, right? And I mean, just to end on a just beautifully optimistic note, and it's a hard life, and New Bedford had probably in 2007, one of the most extreme mass deportation events, right? Something like 342 Guatemalans, mostly women, were deported, were taken into custody by ICE. It's a hard life, right? And yet you see the younger generations. This is so beautiful, right? All these young, mainly teenagers, who just earned the right to vote, organized and petitioned the Massachusetts legislature, and said, New Bedford has, our community in New Bedford, our Central American community is so large, and yet we have no representation because of the way the districts are drawn. And they petitioned and won a district of their own people, of it's mainly a Central American immigrant district. So that in the next election, they will be able to probably elect a representative and send it to the Massachusetts legislature. 18-year-old kids did this. No, it's just phenomenal, right? It gives you a lot of hope.
Okay, Midwestern audience, Francisco and I can go long on New Bedford. So if you want to talk about anything else, please type something into the Q&A and we can reroute a little. Otherwise, I fear we might be in southeastern New England, deep into southeastern New England below. This is all really wonderful. Okay, I'm just looking to see if anything's coming into the chat box. I guess I have one more question, which is, I know you did extensive journalistic work during the Civil War and during the Dirty Wars, and you've talked a little bit about how difficult that was, and it haunts, I feel like, Monkey Boy. So you're in the refuge for people who are wounded in the war. You're always trying to find out if someone might be there. That's the hauntedness of the book, I think. So what is it like to sort of switch writerly modes? How does your journalism influence your fiction writing and vice versa? I mean, you kind of mix it up.
It's hard. Like the line I often use is like when I'm doing when I find myself having to do journalism at the same time that I'm working on fiction, I feel like somebody going around with an axe down the middle of his head. It's I remember when I started Monkey Boy, it just took off. Right. I was working in my study in Mexico City, and out the back window, there was this building that was being built, and a high rise. And I was in a race. I thought that for every chapter, if I could finish a chapter before they added another floor, and I was really cooking. And Ayotzinapa happened, the disappearance of the 43 students in Guerrero in Mexico. And I ended up, having to report that for the New Yorker. I did something like 8 dispatches and a few others elsewhere. And that's when my novel started to bog down. I was just there's just two really opposite ways of thinking about existence in the world and writing. They feed each other. They can feed each other in very positive ways, especially when you're not doing them at the same time, right? Yeah. And so that was really a hard thing to deal with over the, for the next few years. Now I have it more, recently, since I finished Monkey Boy, for example, I want to do a little book based on the Ayotzinapa reporting.
Oh, great.
And I kept on reporting it, right? I'm very close to the special prosecutor in the case. And we meet up every now and then. And, we actually have a deal where I've promised not to do any short-term journalism, right? So it's not to cause him problems. And that way he can tell me all this stuff that he doesn't mind if I publish it in a year or two, as long as I don't publish it next week or next month. And so he really tells me what's going on. And so, I have, so in this space between novels, it's been a fruitful thing to work on. But now I'm really about to dive back into the novel. And I'm going to really limit my time on that, but I'm almost done with it anyway.
So the Ayotzinapa piece, should we look to the New Yorker for it? Where will we find it?
Oh, the book, it'll be a book. The original pieces,
awesome.
The original pieces are there. Yeah. But now I've gone on and kept reporting it, especially over the last 2 years.
We do have a question coming in that says, if we have not read Francisco's novels, where should we start with Monkey Boy? With Monkey Boy, question, like that's an interesting question. Where would you tell them to start? An introduction to Francisco Goldman.
I'd say start with Monkey Boy, right? Because one of the things about Monkey Boy is sort of reflecting on the life, and there's like, tongue-in-cheek references to most of my other books in there, right? I pretend like, obviously, Divine Husband, the Marti book, is massive. And so in Monkey Boy, I pretend that it's like a little 150-page book. And, so it's, I'm reflecting on the various, books I wrote. Why not start with Monkey Boy? Ordinary Seaman, it's.
I got to go with The Ordinary Seaman. Changed my life. I wrote a book, or a chapter of my book is really inspired. My history book is inspired by the work you did there. I love that book. I like all your work. I'm a fan, but Ordinary Seaman blew my mind because I think it has a lot. I think because you are a Latin American novelist who writes in English, the presence of Central and Latin America in Brooklyn Harbor in that maroon ship. That's such a great truth, but also it's such a beautiful metaphor for so many things. But you know, you could read it all.
That once I found that story, that was a story, like I said, it was the opposite of the other things, where once I started it, I knew where that book was going to go, right? I mean, it was, you know, and it had its tropes, you know, right there for me to fill in. You know, it was Heart of Darkness backwards, right? You know, it was, yeah, it was, you know, the Odyssey, but on a boat that never moves, you know. It was, so all these ideas, right, you know, so you could just see the you know, the form of the book was not hard to find. Also Say Her Name, right, which is probably my most well-known book, and, you know, a book that's very close to my heart, obviously. And up, you know, and probably my most successful book up to now, but and has a good chance of becoming a movie. So,
Oh well,
yeah.
I mean,
so.
I would say you can't go wrong.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
I want to read a comment that someone put in the chat. I'm so glad to have the opportunity to hear you speak about your books, Francisco. I have a signed first edition of Say Her Name. Met you when you were on the book tour in Milwaukee. Looking forward to reading Monkey Boy. And that's from F. Tessa Bartels.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah.
That's lovely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think we're about at almost at 8 o'clock. That's all that's come into the chat. But Joel, are you going to come back on and do the concluding ceremonies? Do we all have to like light a torch or anything?
Well, I didn't bring a torch, but no, yes, I will just thank you both so much. I mean, Francisco, we have been looking forward to this for ages and ages. It's just been an absolute thrill. It's been so much fun. It's, you know, even more fun than I expected. And I knew that this would be a wonderful conversation, and it indeed was. It enriches the series so much in ways that Rachel sort of touched on, and just you know, your life and work really kind of epitomize this whole idea of the colors of Jewishness, of the sort of fluidity, and the, you know, how people often think, both Jews and non-Jews often think of Jews in kind of monolithic ways, and you know, everything about you really sort of explodes that in such wonderful ways. And also, you know, as I also knew that this conversation would go in so many other directions. It's about nation and other kinds of borders, and it's about, you know, different kinds of writing. So it's just been an absolute delight. Rachel, thank you so much for having this idea in the first place, and just having Francisco in conversation. Francisco, if and when you're next in town, look us up, and we'll take you out and show you around, and maybe we'll just show up on the doorstep in Mexico City sometime soon. Also, thank you everyone for joining us, and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Francisco.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so
Bye.
much. Bye-bye. And Rachel, stay in touch.
I'm sending you an email tonight with some New Bedford stuff. Don't worry about it. We'll be in touch.
Yeah.
Bye. This is